Hey there. Welcome to a deep dive into one of the most grueling and haunting experiences of World War I life, trapped in the trenches. For millions of soldiers, the trenches weren't just battle lines. They were prisons of mud, fear, and endless hardship. Day after day, men faced unimaginable conditions: choking mud, swarming rats, constant shell fire, and the invisible enemies of disease and exhaustion. In this video, we'll uncover what daily life was really like for those caught in the trenches, far beyond the textbook battles and heroic charges. From the relentless noise of artillery to the eerie silence of no man's land at night, from the bond of comradeship to the crushing loneliness and mental strain, you'll hear the stories that bring this dark chapter of history to life. We'll explore how soldiers coped with hunger, sickness, and the psychological toll of warfare, and what it meant to survive one day and then the next. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a journey into the human spirit under siege. If you're ready to step into the mud, grit your teeth, and see what it truly meant to be trapped in WWI trenches with no way out, make sure to hit like and subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Let's get started. Imagine waking up not to the gentle glow of sunrise or the familiar sounds of birdsong, but to a world shrouded in mud, barbed wire, and endless gray skies. This was the reality for millions of soldiers during World War I, trapped in trenches carved out of earth and soaked by relentless rain. The trenches were more than mere ditches. They were lifelines, prisons, and battlefields, all rolled into one. They stretched for hundreds of miles across Europe, a sprawling network of narrow, winding paths that defined the war's brutal stalemate. From the moment a soldier arrived, the trenches shaped every aspect of life: how they ate, slept, fought, and even dreamed. These confined spaces were a far cry from any notion of glory on the battlefield. Instead, they were a world of claustrophobic tunnels, sharp wooden planks underfoot, and walls caked with mud that never seemed to dry. The trenches themselves were complex systems. At the front line, where the fighting was fiercest, the trenches were narrow and shallow, often only wide enough for a man to crawl through. Behind these front lines were secondary and reserve trenches designed for support, medical aid, and rest, but even these offered little comfort. Connecting these were communication trenches, zigzagging paths that allowed soldiers to move unseen by the enemy. Barbed wire stretched like a cruel maze before the trenches, meant to slow down or trap any advancing enemy. Beyond that lay no man's land, a deadly expanse of craters, mud, and the remnants of shattered trees and broken weapons, where death could come at any moment. Soldiers lived and fought in this frozen hell for months, sometimes years. The trenches were a grim refuge from the chaos above, but they were far from safe. Flooded by rain and churned by constant traffic, they often resembled muddy rivers rather than defensive fortifications. In places, water pooled ankle-deep or higher, turning the floor into a quagmire where soldiers' boots sank with every step. Why did the war settle into this brutal stalemate? The answer lies in the deadly combination of modern weaponry and outdated tactics. Machine guns, rapid-fire artillery, and barbed wire made open attacks almost suicidal. So both sides dug in, creating trenches that turned the battlefield into a grim chessboard where each move was costly. Living in these trenches was an exercise in endurance. Soldiers faced not just enemy bullets, but the constant threat of disease, exposure, and mental strain. The trenches were filled with the sounds of rats scurrying, the cries of wounded men, and the ceaseless roar of artillery overhead. Sleep was scarce, meals were meager, and every day was a fight to simply survive. Yet amid this hellish existence, soldiers found ways to adapt. They reinforced their positions with sandbags and wooden beams, dug dugouts to shelter from shell fire, and created makeshift stoves to cook whatever food they could scavenge. Letters from home were treasured, a brief connection to a world far removed from mud and blood. This introduction to the trenches sets the stage for understanding the true horror faced by soldiers trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear, filth, and futility. It was a place where the line between life and death blurred, and where courage took on new meaning amid the mud and misery. As we journey deeper into trench life, prepare to see the war from the perspective of those who lived it day by day, in a frontline hell that tested the limits of human endurance. If you thought the trenches were just narrow ditches in the ground, think again. They were far worse. Imagine stepping into a world where the earth itself seems to swallow you whole, a place where mud clings to your boots, your uniform, and even your skin, never letting go. For the soldiers in the trenches of World War I, mud wasn't just a nuisance. It was a relentless, suffocating enemy. Rain fell almost constantly in many sectors of the Western Front. The land, churned by artillery and countless footsteps, became a thick, sucking morass. In some places, trenches flooded so deeply that soldiers stood in water up to their knees, unable to escape the cold that seeped into their bones. The water was stagnant and filthy, filled with decaying vegetation, waste, and the remnants of war, the shattered wood of trenches, discarded equipment, and worse. Living in this mud was a daily test of endurance. Walking was a slow, exhausting battle. Each step risked slipping or sinking, and it wasn't uncommon for soldiers to lose boots, or even entire feet, to trench foot. A painful and sometimes fatal condition caused by prolonged exposure to damp, unsanitary conditions. But mud was just the beginning. The trenches teemed with rats, massive, ravenous creatures drawn to the endless supply of food scraps and corpses. These rats were unlike any ordinary vermin. They grew to the size of cats or even small dogs, bold enough to scurry over sleeping men, nibbling on exposed flesh, and gnawing through tents and rations. Soldiers tried to kill them, but the rats were relentless, multiplying in the dark. Cramped trenches where food and dead bodies provided endless sustenance. Filth was everywhere. Toilets were makeshift pits dug into the earth, often overflowing into the trenches themselves. Waste mixed with mud and water, creating a stench so overpowering that soldiers described it as suffocating. Hygiene was nearly impossible to maintain. Baths and clean clothes were rare luxuries, and lice infestations were constant, causing unbearable itching and contributing to the spread of disease. The smell of death lingered perpetually. Bodies, those who had fallen in battle or died from disease, sometimes remained unburied for days or weeks, their decay adding to the fetid air. The sight of decomposing comrades was a brutal reminder of the war's unrelenting toll. Yet, amid this squalor, soldiers developed routines to survive. They cleaned their gear as best they could, patched uniforms with scraps of cloth, and built rudimentary shelters to protect themselves from the elements. They devised systems to manage waste and fought off rats with traps, clubs, and whatever weapons they could fashion. Despite these efforts, the mud, rats, and filth were constant companions, a grim reality that tested the limits of human endurance and spirit. Every day was a battle against the environment itself, as much as against the enemy on the other side of no man's land. This unyielding grime shaped the war's horror, embedding itself not only in the trenches, but in the memories of those who lived through the nightmare. It was a daily grind of survival that few outside the trenches could truly imagine, and one that left scars long after the guns fell silent. Imagine the earth trembling beneath your feet, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and smoke. The sky roars with a deafening, unrelenting thunder that never seems to pause. For soldiers trapped in the trenches during World War I, this was not a moment of battle, it was every moment. The constant threat of shellfire was a defining horror of trench warfare, a terrifying reality that shattered lives and minds alike, day and night. From dawn until dusk, and often through the darkest hours, the battlefield was a cacophony of explosions. Artillery was the dominant force of World War I, Its power reshaped the landscape and dictated the pace of war. Unlike earlier conflicts, where cavalry charges or close combat played major roles, the Great War's weapons of destruction were long-range and devastatingly efficient. Shells rained down in waves, their whistling descent followed by earth-shattering blasts that ripped through trenches, shattered wood and metal, and buried men beneath tons of debris. Soldiers lived in a state of perpetual alert, never knowing when the next barrage would fall or whether they would survive its impact. The trenches, though offering some protection, were far from safe. Artillery was designed to destroy exactly what the soldiers depended on, the narrow, fragile lines they called home. A well-placed shell could collapse a trench section, burying men alive under mud and rubble. Dugouts and shelters offered some refuge, but many were not deep or strong enough to withstand direct hits. The noise was relentless. The sharp crack of a shell exploding close by, the distant rumble of batteries miles away, the ground shaking as if the earth itself were breaking apart. Sleep was a rare luxury. The fear of being caught in a bombardment meant soldiers often stayed awake, jumping at every sound. The human body is not meant for such constant stress, and many men suffered mental and physical exhaustion from the endless bombardment. This bombardment was not random. Artillery crews used careful calculations, maps, and spotters to target enemy trenches, supply lines, and communication networks. Before a planned attack, preparatory bombardments would hammer the enemy's position for days, hoping to destroy defenses and morale. But more often than not, the bombardments left the landscape a shattered wasteland, filled with craters and debris. But the enemy soldiers often survived in deep dugouts, waiting to emerge once the guns fell silent. The effect of shell fire extended beyond immediate physical danger. The constant explosions damaged morale, created an atmosphere of dread, and contributed to the psychological toll on soldiers. The term shell shock entered the language during this war, a condition now understood as a form of PTSD caused by exposure to extreme trauma and the relentless roar of battle. Symptoms ranged from paralysis and muteness to uncontrollable shaking and nightmares. Soldiers developed coping mechanisms. Some turned to dark humor, others to prayer, and many simply tried to shut out the world, focusing on the routine of survival. The bonds between men in the trenches strengthened as they shared not only hardship, but the terror of bombardment. Shell fire also disrupted daily life in practical ways. It destroyed supply routes, killed horses and mules that transported goods, and damaged medical facilities. Wounded men sometimes waited hours or days for evacuation because stretcher bearers could not safely reach the front under heavy fire. The unpredictability of bombardments created a tense environment where danger lurked at all times. Soldiers learned to read the signs changes in the pattern of shelling, the whistle of different shells, and the behavior of officers and fellow men to anticipate attacks. Still, no preparation could fully protect them. Despite all the horror, some moments of resilience emerged. Men dug deeper trenches, built reinforced shelters, and adapted their tactics. Engineers constructed tunnels and bunkers to shield troops, and artillery units developed counter-battery fire to silence enemy guns. But the threat never disappeared. It was a grim fact of life that the sky above the trenches was often filled with death-bearing shells, a deadly rain that shaped the war's brutal character. To understand the experience of the soldiers, we must remember that the shell fire was not just a weapon, but a psychological torment, a constant reminder that no one was truly safe, even when hidden from the enemy's direct line of fire. It was a terror that pressed down on men day and night, shaping every moment they lived in the trenches. War is not only a battle fought with guns and artillery, it is a fight within the minds and hearts of those who endure it. For the soldiers trapped in the endless trenches of World War I, the physical dangers were only part of the terror. The constant, unrelenting fear, the overwhelming noise of explosions, the helplessness in the face of death, all combined to break minds as surely as bodies. This crushing psychological weight would become known as shell shock, one of the earliest recognized forms of what today we understand as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Imagine living every day with the knowledge that death or injury could come in the blink of an eye from an invisible sniper, a sudden artillery barrage, or a random bullet. The fear was omnipresent, a shadow hanging over every moment, allowing no rest or peace. Men who had never known terror found themselves gripped by panic, unable to function, their minds overwhelmed by the chaos around them. The trenches were rife with sensory assault, the thunderous roar of shellfire, the screams of wounded comrades, the choking smoke of explosions, and the perpetual stench of decay. These were not isolated incidents, but a constant storm, battering nerves relentlessly. The brain, conditioned to handle brief moments of danger, was instead subjected to a ceaseless barrage of trauma. Many soldiers began to show signs of mental strain, trembling hands, inability to speak, fits of uncontrollable shaking, nightmares so vivid they jolted men awake screaming. Some became withdrawn, emotionally numb, while others displayed irritability and unpredictable outbursts. The human mind, pushed beyond its limits, found various ways to manifest the trauma it could not process. At the time, medical understanding of this phenomenon was limited. Early doctors were baffled by these symptoms. Some viewed sufferers as cowards or malingerers, accusing them of faking illness to escape the horrors of battle. Others recognized that something deeper was at work, an invisible wound that devastated the mind and spirit. The term shell shock was coined to describe the symptoms believed to be caused by the physical impact of exploding shells on the brain. It was thought that the concussive force caused brain damage, but later research showed that the trauma was often psychological. The term, while helpful in recognizing the problem, also reflected the limited understanding of mental health at the time. Treatment was rudimentary and varied. Some soldiers were sent to specialized hospitals for rest and therapy, while others were returned to the front, their conditions misunderstood or ignored. The stigma attached to shell shock meant many men suffered in silence, ashamed or afraid of being labeled weak. Despite this, shell shock fundamentally changed how war doctors and society viewed mental health. It was one of the first times psychological trauma was acknowledged as a consequence of warfare, laying the groundwork for modern psychiatry. The mental strain was compounded by the isolation many soldiers felt. Cut off from family and familiar comforts, trapped in a grim world of mud and death, loneliness deepened the emotional wounds. Letters from home could be both a comfort and a source of pain, reminding men of the lives they might never return to. Some soldiers found ways to cope. Dark humor became a common defense, jokes and pranks breaking the tension in grim moments. Others relied on camaraderie, the bond between men who shared suffering to hold on to their sanity. Faith and prayer offered solace to some, a way to find meaning amid senseless violence. Yet for many, the mental scars endured long after the guns fell silent. The return to civilian life was fraught with challenges. Veterans struggled with nightmares, anxiety, and depression, often unable to explain the invisible wounds they carried. Society, unprepared to support them, sometimes viewed them with suspicion or pity. The story of shell shock is a tragic chapter in the history of war, revealing that the cost of conflict is not measured only in lives lost, but also in the minds shattered. The soldiers of the trenches fought not just an external enemy, but internal battles that shaped their lives forever. Understanding this mental struggle deepens our appreciation of the courage it took to endure the trenches, the silent battles waged behind the lines, where fear and trauma were as deadly as any bullet. In the hellish world of the trenches, where mud and death surrounded soldiers on all sides, one of the most basic yet relentless struggles was the fight for nourishment. Food and water, the essentials of life, became scarce treasures, sources of constant anxiety and suffering. Every meal, every sip was hard-won, and the conditions under which soldiers ate and drank were often as harrowing as the battles themselves. Imagine waking up hungry after a restless night of broken sleep, the sounds of distant artillery still echoing in your ears, and knowing that the food you might receive would be meager, cold, or sometimes missing altogether. For many soldiers, this was the grim daily reality. The supply lines that brought provisions were vulnerable to enemy fire, poor weather, and logistical challenges. Rain and mud turned roads into quagmires, slowing or halting deliveries. Sometimes fresh food rotted before it could reach the front. The result was a diet that was repetitive, unappetizing, and often insufficient to sustain men under constant physical and mental stress. Typical rations consisted of canned meat, hard biscuits, known as hardtack, and occasionally dried vegetables or preserved fruit. Fresh bread and meat were luxuries, rare treats that lifted spirits temporarily but were quickly consumed. Soldiers joked bitterly about the monotony and poor quality of their meals, referring to some rations as bully beef or shipmas biscuit, with a mix of humor and resignation. Water was another critical concern. Access to clean, safe drinking water was limited. Soldiers often relied on water from wells, streams, or rain collection, but these sources were frequently contaminated by sewage, dead animals, and chemicals from the battlefield. The risk of waterborne diseases like dysentery and cholera was high, making hydration a dangerous necessity. When fresh water was unavailable, soldiers sometimes drank from mud-filled puddles or water collected in shell craters, actions that further exposed them to illness. The thirst and dehydration that followed could sap strength and focus, compounding the physical toll of war. To prepare food, soldiers used whatever means they could. Improvised stoves or small fires were common, but these were risky. Firelight could reveal their position to the enemy. Many ate cold rations or raw food, which increased the risk of digestive problems. Cooking areas were often makeshift, dirty, and cramped, with little sanitation. Hunger and malnutrition weakened soldiers' bodies and minds. Energy levels dropped, wounds healed slowly, and susceptibility to disease increased. The psychological effect of starvation added to the despair. The constant gnaw of hunger was a reminder of the fragility of life in the trenches. Despite these hardships, soldiers found moments of relief. Mail from home sometimes included food parcels with chocolate, biscuits, or tobacco luxuries that lifted morale. When available, shared meals became social events, brief escapes from the grim realities outside the trench walls. Commanders recognized the importance of adequate food and water, but the scale of the war and logistical difficulties made consistent supply a monumental challenge. Efforts to improve ration quality and distribution were ongoing, but could never fully overcome the harsh conditions. The struggle for nourishment was more than a physical necessity. It was a battle for survival and hope amid the filth and fear. Every bite and sip sustained not just the body, but the spirit of men trapped in a war that tested every limit. War is a battle not only against an armed enemy, but against an unseen, relentless foe, disease. In the cramped, filthy trenches of World War I, illness spread like wildfire, claiming more lives than bullets and bombs. Soldiers did not only face the dangers of gunfire and shelling, they were also trapped with bacteria, parasites, and infections that preyed on the weak, the weary, and the unprotected. These invisible enemies turned the trenches into breeding grounds for suffering that was as cruel and deadly as any battlefield attack. The trenches were damp, dark, and overcrowded places. Soldiers stood knee-deep in mud, soaked by rain and sweat, unable to change clothes or bathe properly for weeks at a time. The constant moisture softened skin and opened the door to infections that could cripple or kill. Trench foot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to wet and unsanitary conditions, was one of the most notorious ailments. Feet would swell, turn numb, and develop painful sores that often became gangrenous. Without prompt treatment, which was often impossible in the trenches, amputation became the only option to save the soldier's life. Lice infestations were another common torment. These tiny parasites thrived in the unwashed clothing and bedding, biting and spreading disease. Lice caused intense itching, making rest even harder to find. Worse, lice were responsible for transmitting trench fever, a debilitating illness marked by high fever, severe headaches, and muscle pain. This disease incapacitated thousands of soldiers, often forcing them out of combat for weeks or months. Dysentery and other gastrointestinal infections were rampant, fueled by poor sanitation and contaminated water supplies. Latrines were primitive and often overflowed, sometimes located dangerously close to living quarters or water sources. This lack of hygiene turned the trenches into a breeding ground for bacteria and parasites. Diarrhea and dehydration weakened soldiers, making them more vulnerable to other illnesses and less able to carry out their duties. Other deadly diseases, such as typhus and cholera, spread quickly under these conditions, leading to outbreaks that could decimate entire units. The crowded conditions made social distancing impossible, and medical supplies were limited. Quarantine was rarely an option, and infected soldiers often remained close to healthy comrades, spreading illness further. Respiratory diseases like bronchitis and pneumonia were common, worsened by the cold, damp air, and exposure to chemical weapons like mustard gas. The trenches offered little shelter from the elements, and the constant stress compromised soldiers' immune systems, leaving them defenseless against infections that would otherwise have been minor. Medical staff worked tirelessly to treat these illnesses, but the scale of the problem overwhelmed even the best hospitals. Field medics and nurses faced not only wounds from battle, but waves of sickness that threatened to swamp their resources. Treatments were rudimentary, by modern standards often limited to rest, basic sanitation, and whatever medicines were available. The understanding of germ theory was still developing, and antiseptics and antibiotics were either unavailable or in their infancy. The psychological toll of disease was immense. Soldiers watched friends waste away from infections that could have been prevented in better conditions. The fear of falling ill added another layer of anxiety to an already brutal existence. Illness was a silent killer, striking without warning and leaving devastation in its wake. Efforts to combat these invisible enemies included improving drainage in the trenches, introducing delousing stations, and educating soldiers on hygiene. Commanders enforced routines such as changing socks regularly and cleaning weapons and gear to reduce infection risks. But these measures were only partially effective in the muddy, crowded environment of the front lines. The legacy of disease and infection in the trenches is a stark reminder that war's casualties extend beyond the battlefield. The invisible enemies, bacteria, parasites, and poor sanitation claimed countless lives, shaping the experience of soldiers and the course of the war itself. Understanding the deadly impact of disease reveals a deeper layer of the soldier's suffering and endurance. It was a war fought on multiple fronts, against bullets and bombs, yes, but also against the unseen forces that preyed on the living, turning the trenches into a landscape of both visible and invisible horrors. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the trenches didn't grow quiet. They entered a new kind of darkness, both literal and psychological. Nighttime on the Western Front was a dangerous, eerie world unlike any other. The familiar, if brutal, rhythms of daylight fighting gave way to a tense, unpredictable hours of shadow and silence, broken only by sudden bursts of violence and whispered movement. For the soldiers trapped in the trenches, night was a time of heightened fear, deadly risks, and fragile moments of hope. No man's land, the devastated, crater-pocked stretch of earth between opposing trenches, became a forbidding no man's world after dark. During the day, it was a deadly zone, impossible to cross without being spotted or gunned down by machine guns and snipers. At night, the cover of darkness offered rare opportunities for patrols and reconnaissance missions, but also dangers that were just as lethal, if not more so. As twilight deepened, small groups of soldiers would prepare for what was known as a night patrol. These missions had multiple purposes: gathering intelligence on enemy positions, capturing prisoners, repairing or cutting barbed wire, and sometimes launching surprise raids. The soldiers selected for these operations were often among the bravest or the most expendable men, chosen for their stealth, courage, or desperation. Moving through no man's land under the cloak of darkness required nerves of steel. Every step risked triggering a hidden tripwire, drawing enemy fire, or stumbling into a shell crater that could twist an ankle or worse. The terrain was unfamiliar and scarred by constant bombardment, with jagged barbed wire tangled like thorns, muddy holes filled with water, and the ghosts of past skirmishes etched into every footprint. To navigate, patrols used whispered commands, hand signals, and careful observation of the faintest light or shadow. Even the slightest noise, a snapped twig, a dropped piece of equipment, could betray their position. Soldiers moved slowly and deliberately, their hearts pounding with the knowledge that any mistake might mean death. The enemy was just as alert, sending their own patrols to spy, sabotage, or ambush. Nighttime engagements in no man's land were often brief, brutal, and chaotic. The darkness amplified confusion. Friend and foe sometimes mistook each other in the melee, and the silence shattered by gunfire was deafening. But night was not only about combat. It was also a time for the maintenance of trenches, repairing damage from the day's shelling, reinforcing defenses, and preparing for the next attack. Soldiers hauled sandbags, dug drainage channels, and patched up wiring, their hands numb from cold and grime. These tasks were done under the watchful eyes of officers, and often with the ever-present threat of enemy snipers. Despite the dangers, nighttime also offered moments of fragile humanity. Soldiers lit small, hidden fires to warm themselves, exchanged whispered stories, and savored brief meals stolen from the chaos. Letters were sometimes passed quietly between comrades, a lifeline to the world beyond the mud and blood. The silence of night was often broken by distant gunfire, the crack of rifles, or the sudden eruption of grenades. These sounds could signal a raid, an enemy attempt to advance, or simply the nervous trigger finger of a scared soldier. Each noise sent ripples of tension through the trenches, keeping men alert and ready to respond. Sleep during these hours was sporadic and shallow. Some soldiers managed brief rests in dugouts or shell holes, but many spent the night on edge, listening for signs of trouble. The darkness was a mental trial, as well as a physical one, with fears and nightmares creeping close, fueled by exhaustion and stress. Commanders had to balance the need for rest with the tactical importance of night operations. Exhausted men were less effective, but failure to maintain vigilance could invite disaster. Rotations, watches, and strict orders sought to manage this delicate balance, but the chaos of war often rendered plans moot. The psychological impact of nights in no man's land was profound. The dark became a symbol of the unknown, of death lurking just beyond the trench, of isolation, and of the thin line between life and oblivion. Many soldiers reported that nights were the hardest to endure, when memories, fears, and doubts surfaced most painfully. Yet night also brought a strange kind of camaraderie. Men huddled together in the cold, sharing what little comfort they could find. Songs were sometimes sung softly, jokes whispered, and prayers offered. These acts of connection were small defiant sparks against the darkness. The constant tension of night patrols, the eerie silence pierced by sudden violence, and the tireless work under cover of darkness all shaped the brutal reality of trench warfare. Nighttime was a world apart, a place where the war's cruelty intensified, and where survival demanded every ounce of courage and resilience. Understanding the dangers and the strange rhythms of no man's land at night helps us grasp the full scope of what soldiers endured. The war was not just fought in the glaring light of day, but in the deep, terrifying shadows of night, where every step could be the last and every breath held meant hope. In the relentless chaos of World War I trenches, amid the thunderous roar of artillery and the sharp crack of rifles, one critical lifeline often determined the fate of men and entire battalions: communication. The ability to send and receive orders quickly and accurately could mean the difference between victory and disaster. Yet in a war defined by mud, barbed wire, and shattered landscapes, relaying messages was far from straightforward. Soldiers and commanders relied on a fragile web of runners, pigeons, primitive radios, signal flags, and telephones, all vulnerable to the hazards of the battlefield. The trenches themselves formed a labyrinthine network of lines, bunkers, and dugouts. Orders needed to flow through this maze, from high command down to the frontline troops and back. But the battlefield was anything but a stable environment. Shellfire could sever telephone cables in seconds. Smoke, fog, and darkness obscured visual signals. The noise of battle drowned out voices. And the risk of being targeted by enemy fire made every messenger's journey perilous. One of the most essential and dangerous roles was that of the runner. These soldiers volunteered or were assigned to carry verbal or written messages between command posts and the front lines. Equipped often only with a pencil, paper, and a map, runners had to navigate the mud, trenches, and no man's land under constant threat of enemy fire. They became lifelines, threading through bullets and shells to deliver crucial information on attack timings, reinforcements, or requests for artillery support. Runners had no protection beyond their speed and stealth. Their journeys could be short or stretch for miles, and many never returned. The mental and physical toll was enormous, dashing across exposed terrain, dodging sniper fire, and squeezing through narrow, flooded trenches, all while burdened with the weight of lives depending on their message. The courage of these men was extraordinary, and their role often underappreciated compared to frontline combatants. Alongside runners, pigeons played an unlikely but vital part in communication. Homing pigeons had been used in warfare for centuries, but World War I marked one of their most prominent roles. Carried in cages or small baskets, pigeons were released to fly back to headquarters, carrying tiny capsules with messages strapped to their legs. They were fast, reliable, and could fly over areas where human messengers could not safely tread. Pigeons saved countless lives by delivering vital information about troop movements, enemy attacks, and battlefield conditions. However, they faced their own dangers: gunfire, predators, and exhaustion. Some pigeons became celebrated heroes, awarded medals for their service, immortalized for saving lives by flying through the storm of war. Meanwhile, technological innovations brought primitive radios and telephones to the trenches. Wired field telephones allowed officers to maintain contact with command posts and artillery units, but their utility was limited. Telephone lines were fragile, frequently cut by shellfire or sabotage, requiring constant repair by Signal Corps soldiers risking their lives to reconnect broken cables. Radio communication was in its infancy, bulky, unreliable, and vulnerable to interference and enemy interception. Still, it provided an important new tool, especially for coordinating artillery barrages and air reconnaissance. Operators had to contend with static, battery life, and the constant risk of capture. Visual signals also had their place. Semaphore flags, flares, and lamps were used to send messages when sound and wire failed. At night, flashlights with coded signals could transmit simple commands, but the risk of enemy detection limited their use. Signal flares might illuminate no man's land, but also reveal positions to snipers. Despite these methods, communication was often the weakest link in battle plans. Misunderstandings, delays, and lost messages led to missed opportunities, friendly fire, or failed attacks. Orders that were clear on paper could become garbled as they passed through multiple hands or were misunderstood by exhausted soldiers. Commanders developed elaborate systems to mitigate these risks. Redundant communication channels were established, sending runners alongside pigeon releases and radio calls. For example, detailed maps and written instructions were left with subordinate officers to adapt if contact was lost. The fog of war was not only a metaphor for uncertainty, but a literal obstacle. Weather conditions like fog, rain, or smoke could disrupt all forms of communication. In these moments, trust between officers and troops became paramount. Leaders needed to rely on the initiative and judgment of their men when orders failed to arrive. The psychological strain of communication challenges added another burden. Soldiers worried if their messages would reach comrades or commanders, while officers faced the pressure of making decisions with incomplete or delayed information. The fog of uncertainty was a constant companion. Yet, the ingenuity and bravery of those who maintained the flow of information under fire were vital. Their efforts kept attacks coordinated, defenses prepared, and rescue operations possible. Without them, the war's bloody stalemate would have been even more chaotic and devastating. Communication in the trenches was a lifeline amid the chaos, a complex dance of courage, technology, and human endurance. It was the silent force behind every command shouted in the noise of battle, every order to advance or retreat, and every desperate plea for aid. Understanding the challenges and triumphs of communication under fire gives us a deeper appreciation of the unseen battles waged every day between the noise, the mud, and the shadows that shaped the fate of millions. In the chaotic, claustrophobic world of the trenches, leadership was both essential and extraordinarily challenging. The relationship between officers and enlisted men, between those who gave orders and those who carried them out, was complex, often fraught with tension, respect, and sometimes deep misunderstanding. The role of officers in World War I, trench warfare, was not simply to command, but to navigate an unforgiving battlefield where lives hung on every decision, and where leadership was tested under conditions few could imagine. At the heart of the trenches lay a hierarchy, rigid and steeped in tradition. Officers, often from more privileged backgrounds, were tasked with planning attacks, managing supplies, maintaining discipline, and most importantly, leading men into battle. Enlisted soldiers, drawn from diverse classes and regions, were expected to follow orders, often at the cost of their lives. Yet the trenches blurred these boundaries. The proximity of death and suffering, the shared hardship of mud and blood, forced officers and men into an uneasy camaraderie. Many officers lived alongside their troops, sharing the same dangers and discomforts, a stark contrast to the distant generals safely behind the lines. However, this closeness did not erase differences. Officers were trained in military tactics and expected to enforce discipline, which sometimes bred resentment among soldiers who saw them as out of touch or overly harsh. Conversely, officers often struggled with the enormous responsibility placed upon them, knowing that a wrong order could lead to mass casualties. Leadership in the trenches required a delicate balance of authority, empathy, and decisiveness. Officers had to inspire courage in men facing unimaginable horrors, maintain order in chaos, and adapt quickly to ever-changing conditions. They were strategists, motivators, and at times, diplomats within their own ranks. The challenge of communication between officers and men was constant. Orders had to be clear and concise, but the fog of war made this difficult. Confusion and misinterpretation were common, sometimes with deadly consequences. Officers often had to make split-second decisions without full information, relying on experience, instinct, and the loyalty of their men. Many officers earned the respect and admiration of their troops through bravery and fairness. They led by example, sharing hardships and showing concern for their men's welfare. Stories abound of officers going into no man's land alongside their soldiers, risking everything to inspire or retrieve the wounded. Yet not all officers commanded respect. Some were criticized for incompetence, recklessness, or cruelty. The high casualty rates among junior officers, who were most often at the front lines, reflected both their exposure to danger and, sometimes, poor leadership decisions. The loss of officers could devastate unit morale and effectiveness. Training and experience varied widely. At the war's start, many officers were ill-prepared for the realities of industrial-scale warfare. Traditional tactics clashed with the brutal modern battlefield dominated by machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire. Over time, military education evolved, incorporating lessons learned from the trenches, improving tactics and leadership methods. Discipline was another critical aspect of command. The stresses of trench life led to exhaustion, fear, and sometimes breakdowns. Maintaining order was essential to prevent panic or mutiny. Officers used a combination of authority, encouragement, and, when necessary, punishment. Courts-martial and executions were harsh realities, intended as deterrents, but sometimes they deepened resentment. The officer's role extended beyond the battlefield. They managed logistics, coordinated with medical teams, and liaised with higher command. They carried the burden of planning assaults, often knowing the likely cost in human lives. The psychological weight was enormous, and many officers suffered mental strain akin to the men they led. In the trenches, leadership also meant fostering bonds of trust and loyalty. Men fought not just for country or orders, but for the comrades beside them and the officers who led with integrity. Strong leadership could inspire acts of incredible bravery and sacrifice. Women also played indirect but vital roles in leadership. Nurses, ambulance drivers, and support staff often worked closely with officers to manage wounded soldiers and maintain morale. Their contributions, though sometimes overlooked, were integral to the war effort. The complex dynamics between officers and enlisted men reflect the human side of war, a clash of class, duty, fear, and courage. Leadership was as much about understanding and motivating men as it was about strategy and orders. Studying the role of officers and command reveals the profound challenges of leading in the trenches. It was a role that demanded not only military skill, but deep humanity, a balancing act under the darkest conditions. This balance of authority and empathy shaped the experience of countless soldiers and influenced the course of battles and, ultimately, the war itself. In the unrelenting nightmare of trench warfare, amid the mud, blood, and deafening chaos, one light remained constant for many soldiers: the bonds forged between comrades. Comradeship and camaraderie became lifelines, essential threads of humanity, woven into the fabric of daily survival. These relationships transcended rank, background, and fear, offering solace, strength, and meaning in an otherwise senseless world. The trenches were harsh equalizers. Men from cities and countryside, rich and poor, from distant regions and different cultures, found themselves thrown together in close quarters. Strangers became brothers in arms, united by the shared ordeal. The proximity of suffering and death accelerated the forging of friendships that might have otherwise taken years to develop. Life in the trenches was brutal, but laughter and stories offered brief respites. Soldiers told jokes, sang songs, and exchanged tales from home, sometimes true, sometimes exaggerated, for entertainment and distraction. Humor, often dark and irreverent, helped men cope with the horrors surrounding them. It was a shield against despair, a way to reclaim a sense of control. Letters home and the sharing of news from the front also bonded men. They talked about family, girlfriends, hopes, and fears, creating a shared world that extended beyond the barbed wire and mud. These moments of connection reminded them of what they fought for and what they might one day return to. Food, though often scarce in the land, became a communal event when possible. Sharing rations or salvaged treats forged a sense of generosity and mutual care. Even small acts, offering a cigarette, helping a wounded friend, or covering a comrade's watch strengthened these ties. Trust was paramount. Soldiers relied on each other for survival, whether in battle or daily life. Knowing that a comrade had your back, that someone would pull you from a shell hole or stand beside you under fire, created unbreakable bonds. This trust was earned through shared hardships and tests of courage. Camaraderie also manifested in rituals and traditions unique to each unit. Nicknames, songs, and inside jokes created a sense of identity and belonging. These small cultural pockets offered comfort and normalcy amid the chaos. The emotional support found in comradeship was vital for mental health. Men confided their fears, nightmares, and grief to those who understood best their fellow soldiers. This shared vulnerability created deep connections and a sense of collective resilience. However, the loss of comrades was one of the most devastating aspects of trench life. Soldiers witnessed friends fall, sometimes in gruesome ways, and had to carry on. Mourning was often private, marked by quiet remembrance or small gestures in the trenches. The weight of these losses bonded men even tighter, fueling determination, but also deep sorrow. Officers who recognized the importance of camaraderie often fostered it intentionally, encouraging group cohesion and morale-building activities. Yet the camaraderie was not without challenges. Conflicts arose, personalities clashed, and the stresses of war sometimes strained relationships. But overall, the shared struggle created bonds that endured. The stories of comradeship from the trenches speak to the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the darkest times, men found ways to connect, to care, and to hold on to hope through each other. These friendships were a form of resistance against the dehumanizing effects of war, a declaration that even amidst destruction, humanity remained. Understanding comradeship in the trenches reveals a profound layer of the war experience. It was not just a conflict of nations and weapons, but a deeply personal struggle supported by friendship, loyalty, and love. For many soldiers, the bonds formed in the trenches were among the most meaningful and lasting aspects of their lives, a testament to the power of connection in the face of unimaginable adversity. War in the trenches was a grim paradox of endless waiting, punctuated by moments of intense, brutal violence. Among the most harrowing experiences for soldiers were trench raids and attacks violent, chaotic forays into enemy lines that demanded courage, cunning, and often resulted in terrifying hand-to-hand combat. These small-scale battles within the larger war were a crucible of fear and ferocity, revealing both the worst horrors and the rarest acts of heroism. Trench raids were often launched at night, or during the early dawn hours when darkness provided some cover. The goal was to surprise the enemy, gather intelligence, capture prisoners, destroy fortifications, or simply unsettle the opposing troops. Unlike large offensives planned and executed over weeks, raids were swift, savage, and deeply personal confrontations. For soldiers involved, there was no room for hesitation. Preparation for a raid was meticulous yet nerve-wracking. Officers and soldiers would study enemy trenches maps. Aerial photos and spy reports helped identify weak points or targets. Stealth was paramount. Men carried knives, pistols, grenades, and bayonet silent weapons preferred to rifles, which could give away their position. The men rehearsed their movements quietly, steeling themselves for the horror ahead. As the moment arrived, groups of soldiers slipped out from their own trenches, moving in single file through the mud and broken landscape of no man's land. Every step was fraught with danger. Barbed wire entanglements, shell holes, and the constant threat of enemy patrols demanded absolute vigilance. The cold night air was pierced by the pounding of hearts and the crunch of boots on frozen mud. When the raiders reached the enemy trench, chaos erupted. There was no grand strategy, now only brutal, chaotic close combat. Soldiers engaged in hand-to-hand fighting, using knives, fists, and bayonets. The confined space of the trenches amplified the terror. Men grappled in the darkness, faces inches apart, fighting for survival. The air was thick with sweat, blood, and the cries of the wounded. Grenades were thrown blindly into dugouts and bunkers. Explosions shattered the night, filling the trenches with smoke and dust. The noise was overwhelming, a mixture of screams, gunfire, and the clash of steel. Amid this, the objective was to strike quickly and retreat before reinforcements arrived. The stakes were deadly. Raids could turn on a single mistake. A noise, a flash of movement, a missed step could alert the enemy and transform the raid into a deadly trap. Many men lost their lives or were captured during these incursions. The psychological toll was immense, knowing that at any moment, death or capture could come from the shadows. Survivors of raids often returned covered in mud, physically and mentally scarred. Some were hailed as heroes, their bravery recognized in medals and commendations. Others carried invisible wounds, haunted by the violence they had witnessed or inflicted. The intimate nature of the combat made these memories especially hard to bear. Trench attacks on a larger scale were even more terrifying. Planned offensives required soldiers to climb out of their trenches and charge across no man's land, facing machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire. The going over the top was a phrase etched into history for its deadly symbolism. These attacks often resulted in massive casualties, with waves of men cut down before reaching the enemy lines. The horror of witnessing comrades fall, sometimes moments after setting foot on the battlefield, was a constant trauma. Soldiers struggled with the shock and helplessness of being unable to save friends caught in the deadly crossfire. Yet, they pressed forward, driven by duty, fear, or the hope of survival. Despite the horror, trench raids and attacks played critical roles in the war. It kept enemy forces off balance, gathered valuable intelligence, and tested defenses. Commanders sought to balance the tactical gains with the human cost, often walking a fine line between aggression and preservation. The stories from trench raids reveal the complex nature of courage and fear. Men faced their worst nightmares, yet displayed moments of extraordinary bravery, camaraderie, and resilience. The personal nature of these battles, the close quarters, the face-to-face fighting, made them uniquely terrifying and unforgettable. Understanding the brutal reality of trench raids and attacks helps us grasp the intense human experience behind the strategic movements and statistics of war. It was a world where survival depended on quick thinking, raw courage, and sometimes sheer luck. These violent confrontations, though short, left lasting scars on those who lived through them and shaped the collective memory of World War I. War is often imagined as relentless action, constant fighting, explosions, and adrenaline-fueled moments of heroism. Yet for the soldiers trapped in the trenches during World War I, much of their time was spent waiting. Long, grinding stretches of inactivity, sometimes lasting days, weeks, or even months, became the defining rhythm of trench life. These long lulls were a double-edged sword, a blessing that spared men from constant danger, but a curse that bred boredom, fear, and restlessness. Understanding these long waits is essential to grasp the full experience of trench warfare, the mental battle waged during the silent hours that could wear down even the strongest spirit. When a soldier descended into the trenches, he entered a world that was as much about endurance as combat. The trenches were muddy, cramped, and uncomfortable, but they were also places where time seemed to stretch endlessly. Outside the few planned attacks or patrols, the front was often quiet. The enemy sat just meters away, hidden behind barbed wire and earthworks, and yet, for hours on end, nothing might happen. This calm was deceptive. It was a pause loaded with tension and expectation. Waiting became a soldier's constant companion. Days were marked less by action and more by the slow, creeping passage of time. Men awoke to the same sights and sounds, facing the same dangers, but no immediate orders to advance or defend. The trench became a liminal space between life and death, action and stillness, hope and despair. Boredom was the inevitable result of these long lulls. Soldiers, trained for battle but forced into inactivity, struggled to fill the hours. There were few distractions. Books and letters provided solace for some, but paper was scarce, and the darkness of the trenches limited reading times. Games, singing, and storytelling were common ways to pass time, but even these lost their charm after weeks of repetition. The monotony was oppressive. Soldiers described it as hell without fire. The endless mud, the smell of decay, the ceaseless presence of rats and lice, and the distant sounds of war created a surreal environment where the mind drifted. Some turned to humor, telling jokes or playing pranks to keep spirits up. Others found comfort in religious rituals, quiet prayers, or writing letters home. Restlessness was another symptom. The desire to move, to act, to do something meaningful, battled with the fear and knowledge that any action could mean death. Soldiers wrestled with the paradox of craving the excitement of combat, yet fearing its reality. This tension created psychological strain. Anxiety, irritability, and bouts of anger or despair were common. Fear simmered beneath the surface throughout the lulls. A silence was often a prelude to violence. Shelling could begin without warning. The enemy might launch a surprise attack. Mines could explode underfoot. The unknown loomed large, and every noise, the snap of a twig, the distant whistle of a shell, was a reminder of mortal danger. Soldiers learned to live with this constant alertness, a state of hypervigilance that was exhausting. Letters from home were a lifeline, but could also deepen despair. Reading news of life beyond the trenches underscored the gap between the war zone and normalcy. Some men felt guilt for surviving, while loved ones suffered far away. Others found strength in the thought of returning home, but the waiting made that future feel distant and uncertain. Sleep was elusive during the long lulls. The cold, damp conditions, combined with noise from artillery or patrols, made rest difficult. Anxiety and boredom disrupted sleep cycles, leading to exhaustion that dulled the senses, but also heightened vulnerability. Soldiers developed coping mechanisms, napping during the day, sharing lunches, or finding small comforts where they could. Routine became a vital structure in this emptiness. Daily tasks like cleaning weapons, repairing trenches, cooking, or maintaining equipment gave men a sense of purpose. These chores, though mundane, were essential for survival and morale. Officers often encouraged routine to prevent despair from taking hold. Yet the longer the waiting stretched on, the harder it was to maintain discipline and focus. Soldiers grew impatient, sometimes rebellious. Mutinies and desertions, though relatively rare, were symptoms of the psychological toll. Commanders faced the difficult task of managing not just physical defenses, but the fragile mental states of their men. Camaraderie played a crucial role in weathering these periods. Shared stories, jokes, and acts of kindness helped keep men connected. The bonds formed in the trenches were strengthened by the collective endurance of boredom and fear. These relationships were a lifeline, turning long hours of waiting into moments of solidarity. The lulls also allowed time for reflection and letter writing, where soldiers processed their experiences and emotions. Many wrote candidly about their fears, hopes, and losses, leaving behind a rich legacy of personal accounts that reveal the inner lives of those who fought. The paradox of waiting in the trenches, between the desire for action and the dread of death, defined much of the soldier's experience. These long periods shaped not just the war's tactics, but its psychological landscape. Understanding the lulls reveals the invisible battle for sanity and hope waged beneath the surface of the visible conflict. In sum, the long lulls in the trenches were a test of endurance as grueling as any assault. They were marked by boredom, fear, restlessness, and the constant shadow of death. Yet, within this harsh reality, soldiers found ways to survive mentally and emotionally, forging bonds and routines that sustained them through the darkest hours. In the desolation of the trenches, where mud swallowed boots and death lurked in every shadow, one thing pierced the gloom with a fragile beam of hope: mail from home. Letters and parcels, carried across dangerous battlefields by countless couriers, became lifelines connecting soldiers to a world beyond war. For the men entrenched in the endless mud, the worn paper of a letter, the familiar handwriting of a loved one, or a small parcel of comforts were far more than just messages or gifts. They were reminders of humanity, anchors of hope, and sometimes cruel symbols of all that had been lost. The journey of mail during World War I was itself a feat of endurance and coordination. Behind the front lines, vast military postal services labored tirelessly, sorting and transporting millions of letters and packages from families across the world. Trains, ships, horses, and motor vehicles moved mail from cities to camps, then to the edge of the trenches. From there, it was handed to runners, pigeon carriers, or delivered through fragile telephone networks to reach the individual soldier in his muddy hole. But the war's brutality meant that not every letter arrived. Mail could be delayed, lost, or destroyed by enemy fire. Yet the determination to keep communication alive never faltered. Commanders understood that morale depended heavily on these fragile links to home. Units established postal officers, and soldiers treasured every piece of mail that came their way. For the soldiers, receiving mail was an event of profound significance. The sight of an envelope with familiar handwriting brought joy that cut through the weariness of trench life. Letters from mothers, wives, sisters, and children spoke of everyday life far from the carnage. They reminded men of birthdays, holidays, and simple pleasures: a warm meal, a spring day, a shared laugh. Reading these letters, soldiers found moments of escape. They could imagine a garden in bloom or the comforting voice of a loved one. For many, the letters were a balm to loneliness and fear, affirming that someone cared, that life continued beyond the front. Parcels added another layer of comfort. Packages brought food treats, tobacco, soap, socks, photographs, and small tokens of affection. These parcels were sometimes homemade, crafted with love and care, reflecting the intimate bonds between the soldier and his family. Sharing a rare chocolate bar or lighting a cigarette from a cherished pack could brighten the darkest night. However, mail was also a source of heartache. Letters sometimes carried news of illness, loss, or hardship back home. Soldiers read about friends who had died, families struggling to survive, or communities devastated by the war. The distance between the trenches and home felt greater with every piece of bad news. Waiting for letters became a mix of hope and anxiety. Some men wrote daily, pouring their thoughts and fears onto paper, while others kept their feelings bottled up. The uncertainty of when or if a reply would come added to the emotional strain. Censorship shaped the content of many letters. To maintain security and morale, military authorities monitored correspondence, often cutting out sensitive details or forbidding mention of the war's horrors. Soldiers learned to read between the lines, finding hidden meanings or subtle reassurances in seemingly mundane words. The act of writing was therapeutic. Soldiers wrote to connect, to remember, and to preserve their identities beyond the battlefield. They shared stories, asked for news, and expressed love or regret. These letters formed the dialogue that bridged the gulf between war and home, anchoring soldiers to their pasts and futures. Mail also played a role in maintaining discipline and order. Officers used letters to communicate orders or encouragement, while families wrote to urge their loved ones to be brave and faithful. The mail system became a conduit of emotional support as much as logistics. Trench life was shaped by these waves of correspondence. Soldiers waited eagerly for mail calls, sometimes spending hours in line to receive a handful of letters. The reading of letters was often done in groups, fostering moments of shared joy or sorrow. These gatherings reinforced the bonds of camaraderie and reminded men that they were not alone. Yet, the disruption of war meant that letters could also bring despair. Soldiers sometimes received news of their own injuries, or those of comrades, or the death of family members. The emotional weight of such information was heavy, especially when delivered in a cold, impersonal manner. The rituals surrounding mail became part of trench culture. Men guarded their letters fiercely, hiding them from others, or proudly displaying photographs slipped inside envelopes. Some carried letters sewn into their uniforms, close to their hearts. These tokens were sources of courage and identity in an alien, hostile environment. For families at home, writing to soldiers was an act of faith and defiance. Despite rationing, fear, and loss, they crafted letters to remind their loved ones that they were remembered, loved, and awaited. These messages crossed continents and battle lines, embodying hope amid despair. The legacy of wartime mail endures in the countless letters preserved in archives and collections. These personal writings reveal the human dimension of war, the hopes, fears, and resilience of those caught in history's greatest conflict. They remind us that amid destruction, it was the simple act of connection that sustained many. In the trenches, where death was ever present, mail was a fragile thread linking the living to a world beyond. It was a symbol of love, a bearer of news, and a bearer of memory. Through letters and parcels, soldiers found the strength to endure, the courage to fight, and the hope that one day they would return home. The trenches of World War I were more than just a battleground. They were a crucible that forged unimaginable suffering on the bodies and minds of the men who endured them. The physical and psychological toll of trench life extended far beyond the front lines, leaving wounds visible and invisible that would last a lifetime. Understanding this toll is crucial to comprehending the full cost of the Great War, not just in statistics and military outcomes, but in human lives irrevocably altered. Physically, the conditions in the trenches were brutal. Soldiers lived in damp, cramped spaces where mud clogged every crevice, and hygiene was nearly impossible to maintain. The trenches were infested with lice, rats, and a constant stench of decay. These factors led to a host of debilitating diseases and injuries that weakened bodies and sapped strength. Trench foot, a painful and sometimes gangrenous condition caused by prolonged exposure to wet and unsanitary conditions, was common. Men suffered numbness, swelling, and severe infections that could lead to amputation. Beyond trench foot, respiratory illnesses plagued soldiers. The cold, damp air, combined with dust and gas attacks, damaged lungs and made breathing difficult. Influenza and pneumonia outbreaks spread rapidly in the close quarters, killing many. Dysentery and other gastrointestinal diseases, fueled by contaminated food and water, caused severe weakness and death. Medical care, though improving, was limited and often overwhelmed. Injuries from combat added another layer of suffering. The modern weapons of World War I machine guns, artillery shells, and poison gas inflicted wounds of unprecedented severity. Soldiers returned from attacks with shattered limbs, deep lacerations, burns, and chemical injuries. Amputations were frequent, and many survivors faced lifelong disability. The crude medical techniques of the time often meant slow, painful recoveries with a constant risk of infection. Psychologically, the impact was equally devastating, but far less understood at the time. The relentless stress of combat, the terror of shellfire, the loss of comrades, and the unending presence of death created a mental landscape of trauma. Soldiers faced what was then termed shell shock, now recognized as a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Symptoms included tremors, paralysis, nightmares, anxiety, and emotional numbness. The stigma surrounding mental health during the war often meant that sufferers were misunderstood or labeled as cowards. Many soldiers hid their symptoms, fearing shame or punishment. Yet the psychological wounds ran deep. The long months of waiting in the trenches, punctuated by moments of extreme terror, created cycles of fear and exhaustion that eroded resilience. The loss of friends and comrades was a profound psychological blow. Soldiers witnessed horrific deaths and carried the memories of those who fell. Survivors' guilt was common, as men struggled to reconcile their survival with the fate of those lost. Letters from home could compound this pain, reminding men of lives interrupted and futures stolen. Sleep disturbances were rampant. The sounds of bombardment, the fear of attack, and physical discomfort made restful sleep elusive. Exhaustion was both a physical and mental hazard, reducing the ability to cope and increasing vulnerability to illness and injury. The monotony and confinement of trench life also contributed to psychological strain. Soldiers battled boredom and loneliness, feelings of helplessness, and a loss of identity. Many turned to alcohol or other coping mechanisms, which brought their own dangers. Medical advances during the war began to address some physical and psychological injuries, but treatments were rudimentary by modern standards. Field hospitals and medical units worked tirelessly, but resources were stretched thin. The psychological aspect was especially neglected, with few effective therapies or support systems in place. The long-term consequences of trench life extended well beyond the war's end. Many veterans returned home with chronic health problems, both visible and hidden. Physical disabilities limited their ability to work or live independently. Psychological trauma affected relationships, employment, and mental well-being. The war's scars shaped generations. Societies struggled to support these veterans. Efforts were made to provide pensions, medical care, and rehabilitation, but the scale of need was overwhelming. Many men felt abandoned or misunderstood. The silence around mental health issues delayed progress in care for decades. The physical and psychological toll of trench warfare was a tragic testament to the brutal nature of industrialized war. It revealed the limits of human endurance and the profound cost of conflict. Remembering these effects honors those who suffered and reminds us of the need for compassion and care for all who bear the wounds of war. For soldiers entrenched in the unending mud and misery of World War I's front lines, the moment of relief, the time when they were finally rotated out of the trenches, was a complicated and profound experience. Leaving the trenches did not simply mean escape from physical danger. It marked a transition fraught with emotional conflict, psychological challenges, and the daunting task of returning to what was called normal life, though nothing felt normal anymore. This final phase of a soldier's time in the trenches encapsulated both hope and uncertainty, freedom and fear. After weeks or months living amidst the horrors of constant bombardment, relentless mud, and ever-present death, the news that one would be pulled back behind the lines was welcomed like a reprieve from a nightmare. Soldiers longed for clean clothes, warm food, and the chance to sleep on a proper bed. Relief came in rotations, carefully scheduled to prevent entire units from being absent simultaneously. When the moment arrived, men prepared to leave the trenches behind, carrying with them the grime, exhaustion, and trauma of their experiences. But relief was not a simple joy. Many soldiers felt guilt at leaving comrades still in danger, a phenomenon known as survivor's guilt. The bonds forged in the trenches made departure bittersweet. Men worried about those who remained, haunted by the fear that they might not see their friends again. This emotional burden was heavy, mixing relief with sorrow and responsibility. The physical journey out of the trenches was a slow and often hazardous process. Soldiers had to navigate the labyrinth of dugouts, communication trenches, and barbed wire. They passed through medical stations and rest camps before reaching safer zones. Each step away from the front was a step away from the daily reality that had dominated their lives. Yet the memories clung tightly. Once behind the lines, soldiers encountered a different world. Rest camps offered better food, clean clothing, and hygiene facilities, a stark contrast to the trenches. Some men experienced joy in these small comforts: the smell of fresh bread, the warmth of a fire, or the chance to write letters home. Others found the sudden quiet unsettling. The constant noise and chaos of battle had become familiar. Silence was alien and stirred anxiety. Psychologically, leaving the trenches was a challenge. Soldiers had to process what they had witnessed and endured while preparing to return to duty or, in some cases, to civilian life. The trauma of combat did not vanish with distance from the front. Many men struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, and emotional numbness. The tension between relief and unresolved fear created a complex mental state. For those who had survived long enough to be sent home on leave or discharged, the transition was even more profound. Returning to families and communities after months or years in war zones was both joyous and alienating. Veterans found themselves changed, physically weakened, emotionally scarred, and socially isolated. They struggled to explain their experiences, often met with misunderstanding or silence. The contrast between the war's horrors and the relative peace at home was jarring. Everyday concerns, trivial to those who had faced death daily, could feel overwhelming. Some soldiers found comfort in routine and work. Others grappled with depression and disconnection. The loss of comrades and the disruption of life plans weighed heavily. Many veterans faced stigma related to physical disabilities or psychological wounds, which were poorly understood. Society's expectations of heroism clashed with the realities of trauma. The difficulty in reintegration led to feelings of alienation, sometimes exacerbated by economic hardship or lack of support. For those returning to the front after a period of rest, the experience was often a return to the same cycle of fear and endurance. The temporary relief was overshadowed by the knowledge that danger awaited. Yet the hope of eventual demobilization and peace helped sustain men through repeated rotations. Military leadership recognized the importance of rest and recovery, but the demands of war often limited the time available. Soldiers faced the ongoing challenge of maintaining morale amid exhaustion and uncertainty. The cycle of going over the top, enduring combat, and then withdrawing became a grim rhythm. The long-term impact of leaving the trenches extended beyond the individual. Families, communities, and nations were affected by the collective trauma of a generation. The experiences of soldiers shaped post-war culture, politics, and memory. Literature, art, and testimony from veterans provide invaluable insight into this difficult transition. They reveal the deep ambivalence of relief and the unknown hope shadowed by loss, freedom tinged with fear. In the end, leaving the trenches was not an end, but a beginning, the start of a new battle to reclaim identity, health, and purpose. It was a moment marked by gratitude, grief, and the profound realization that the war's scars would remain long after the guns fell silent. Thanks for sticking with me through this deep dive into the daily realities of life in the WWI trenches. We've seen the grit, the horror, the brotherhood, and the long road soldiers faced, both during and after their time on the front lines. It wasn't just about fighting. It was about surviving the unimaginable and carrying those scars long after the war ended. If this journey into history moved you or gave you a new understanding of what those brave men endured, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that bring the past to life. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss the next video. And if you have any thoughts or questions, drop a comment below. I love hearing from you and diving deeper into these topics. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, stay curious and keep exploring history's untold stories.